Good evening. So, what's the question? What does title mean? Let me give you a bit of my background. I have up there a diploma from Baylor University. It's a Bachelor of Arts in telecommunication. I basically it was a radio, TV, film degree. Um, Now, what did they teach me? Well, they taught me how to handle a camera, how to edit, how to um, how to do a number of things that involve um, making videos, making moving pictures. There was, some radio aspect. There was audio aspect. They had part of it. Part of the degree was a course about journalism, from which I learned a lot. Part of it was also a public speaking course. But let me be very clear about what my intentions were. I didn't have the I think the math or the other sort of courses that I thought to get into a film school. So this was sort of my attempt to do a film school sort of thing. Um, but I'm not the sort of person who just makes. I'm more of a writer who wants to adapt his own stuff than I am a filmmaker who wants, you know, a through and through filmmaker who just wants to, who just wants to make movies you know, I find I have more of the resources to make the one than the other. But really, what is it? Why am I telling you all this? Um, because I believe that our nation has a problem. And that problem is it's beginning to lose perspective on the differences between storytelling and reality. And part of the reason why is that we have a leader who is basically a malignant cancer of dishonesty. And I say that not to be, for the sake of um, not for the sake of political exaggeration, but because I genuinely think that the man is utterly lacking in morals. And being so utterly lacking in morals, he just cannot see what the problem is with distorting everybody else's sense of reality so he can gain. Yeah, I don't think I have the energy for my usual sort of hour rant. So I'm going to keep this to about 15 minutes. But I just want to share my perspective on storytelling as somebody who values it quite a great deal. I mean, storytelling is what I think saved my life earlier because it allowed me to take a break from a psychologically brutal world one where people were actively trying to break me down psychologically. And why? Because they were trying to help me. I think some of them might have gotten that sense of it, but you know, I figured out after a while that what they really were wanting to do was dominate me, use me to make themselves feel better, to do whatever. They were trying to dominate me. They were trying to rule my life, and I didn't want to do that. So it's sort of like in the end, a lot of it depended on not so much convincing me of the truth of what they were saying about me, but I think part of it was convincing me that it didn't matter um, what the truth of you know what the truth of who I was or what I was, that it didn't matter, that what mattered was what people thought, and that I had to chase after what people thought to in order to not be stomped down, destroyed, whatever. And I sort of I had a moment where I understood that I could go on trying to convince people that um I could go on trying to convince people that I wasn't bad, uh, that I wasn't a geek or something, that I wasn't a nerd, that I wasn't this or that. I could go on trying to convince them that I was one of them, or I could, you know, just giving up everything that meant something to me, or I could keep myself and say I am there. I exist. I don't need your validation in order to continue my existence. That's the decision I think that saved my life. And part of what helped me you know, part of it was that in the end, that I made the decision, you know, I didn't really have a lot of friends in that period. I still have few folks who I would say are more than just acquaintances, more than just coworkers with whom I'm friendly with. You know, good people, but I'm not very social, even with good people. I'm kind of just a little. I can go about the inch deep, but I don't really have that sort of innate idea of how to go further. But let me get back onto topic. And the topic is one's sense of reality. And one thing that I keep on coming back to, and it's not because I'm some virtuous person, it's because my brain makes me a stickler for things being true, being real. It can't understand people not basing stuff on what's real, what's true. Because things either are or they are not. They are either a reality or they're not. And when you try and blur the lines between the two, that's when you really get into trouble. It's why Trump constantly gets into trouble because for him, the fantasy, the image is always more important than the reality. But the reality, reality has a nasty way of insisting upon itself, on being self-generative. It's like you can tell people one thing is true and get them to believe it, but the evidence of for other things will exist in greater variety and greater quantity because things that exist that have an actual effect on reality, they create implications, they create consequences, they create results. So a person who's trying to lie to you will just be always chasing after those things, trying to beat down every little bit of evidence of their dishonesty. So, as a person who writes fiction, here's what I would say. I would say that you hear about realistic, you hear about practical effects, and the whole sort of idea seems to be to try and convince people that your fiction is real. And to a certain extent, that's understandable. You know, to get people to forget that they're watching a movie, that's an intense sort of experience and one that filmmakers rightly try and follow and create. The trick is that it can sometimes get people going overboard on canon and lore. Canon and lore. Canon. This is canon. It is a, new revised standard version Bible that I bought. I think this is 27 years old, and you know I've read just about everything in this. Not often. I'm not a person who rereads things on a constant basis, but I am familiar with what's in there. I'm also familiar with how what's in there got there. This is when we talk about the canon, that talk about the canon starts with the canon back there. Starts with the set of books that at the Council of Nicaea that the Emperor Constantine and his you know the people he worked with in the Christian church, those are the books of the Bible that they established as being authoritative. And I'm a what I'll tell you is I do believe that Jesus actually existed. Did he say all the things he said? I don't know. I That's where faith comes in. I have faith that he's much like the person portrayed in the Gospels. Um, um, but I believe that a lot of what happened in the Bible, I wouldn't call it strictly fictional because I believe that a lot of people believe that what was in those stories that they were telling was true. But I think that they would tell you that there was a lot of uncertainty about it, that these were legends, that w- that at least for a lot of the oral tradition in there, that there was sort of a kind of, sort of, a sense that while it might be truthful, it's a truthfulness about something that is fairly detached from our current reality. That there's kind of, that even back then there was a sense that things that were legendary, things that were myths, that they were kind of stories about an ancient, about a past that was beyond personal memory, living memory. And that's part of the thing. The thing about it is that sooner or later, even our own day and age will become part of, stop being part of living memory. If the average person lives to about 70 or 80, and about 100 is the limit, then I think we'll get to a point about, you know, in about, we'll get to a point about 2080 where all memory, all living memory of my time will be gone. And all that will be left will be what of that will be what was written, will be the evidence that the acts and other, what people did leave behind, the videos, if they're still in some form, the films, if they're still in some form, so on and so forth. And that's not reality. That's a shadow of our reality. That's a memory, a memory frozen in a medium, but not living in that medium anymore. You won't be able to so easily get back into people's, go and ask somebody, did you this, did you that? There will be at some point a separation between what we know of this reality, this current reality, and that reality. And all that will be left in any real terms will be the stories that were told, the stories that were listened to, and so on and so forth. And this is at a time where we've got video, we've got film, we've got audio recordings of people from times before. So there are more ghosts, you know, other than just what was written down literally. There are more ghosts of the past existing in that form. And I think that's something to keep in mind here when we talk about stories of the past. 1950s. My mother was born in the 1950s. Her childhood, that was 1950s. And things were, I mean, and I listened to my great aunt Mimi, who was around, um, I think in the teens, even the early. 1900s. Grandpa was born in 1920. You know, there are parts of, there are parts of the world that once were within living memory that are now completely divorced from it. This is, I think, the real important thing to understand is that all we have of the past at a certain point is sort of a faded, limited, partial memory of it. We don't have all the pieces. We don't know all the pieces. And in fact, we've destroyed in the process of doing what we've done, of all the business we've done, of all the laws we've changed, the attitude in government that we've changed, all the things we've done have set this country and set our government and set everything on a different course. Yet people want the same things that existed back in the 40s and the 50s. And besides the fact that so much has moved on in that time, that reality itself has taken a hand and forced things to change, that our technology developing the way it is has changed the basic ways in which we relate to one another, we interact with one another, do how we do things. Trump and other people trying to roll back the years, trying to make things like they once were, they're fools. I have to say it that way. They're fools because the truth of the matter is the clock cannot be wound backwards. You cannot resurrect the past. It is dead. It I often say it in a gentler way by saying it belongs to God. The people who used to know these things, who used to live these things, who used to do these things, they're with God now. And if you don't believe in God, there was a period in my life I didn't believe in God, so I'm fairly tolerant of people who have decided on atheism because I understand what their logic is. And for them, it's just there's no need. For them, the thought is there's no need. At least as far as I understood it, for me it was we have an explanation for how things came about that does not need an additional element, an element that seemed more like a fantasy element and a superstitious element back when I was you know a kid. I changed my mind over time, but I haven't lost that sense that you don't have to really hate God or hate religion in order to not want to believe in God. And the part of but the thing about it is, how do you get people back to a position where that is the norm? And the answer is you really can't force that. It's something that has to evolve of its own accord. That has to happen by the grace of God, if you will. And too many people, they don't want to let it happen by the grace of God. They want to force it to happen. And it's part of why they bought into the whole, Trump as a messenger of God. They're saying, oh, well, Trump uses sinners. Look, he used Moses, but, Moses repented of what he did. Moses didn't go, okay, it was, Moses recognized that he was not entirely worthy. And when he did go a little too far, when he let himself go out of control, well, he paid the price for it. The price was he would never enter the Holy Land. Now, these stories, the way I think about them, I don't believe in them as literal truth. I mean, for all I know, God could have done the miracles that were in that story. But I think we should understand something about the way people looked at things in those days. Again, it is the thing of, we have hindsight bias because we know things how things work scientifically. We've learned that, you get tsunamis, tidal waves because of earthquakes and such, because of volcanoes and such. Um, we know why a tsunami might happen, why the sea might suddenly withdraw and then come back in. So we can speculate. Oh well, maybe it was a volcanic eruption that caused a big tsunami to go and wash over the Egyptians, and that's what they remember as the withdrawal of the Red Sea, and the splashing back of that Red Sea, and so on and so forth. And that's something I actually suggested to the teacher up at Baylor. Um, and what the response was, that it wasn't, that a lot of that story was kind of just wrong on, the wrong sort of reads, the wrong sort of uh, language, and then instead that a lot of it centered around a belief that water was chaos, the primordial chaos out of which everything was composed. And that, explanation fascinated me because it got me thinking of how would people would tell the story in the shoes of the people who are actually telling the story. We might go, oh, so what was the real sort of reason why this recorded event seemed to happen? You know, and we get sort of stuck on trying to create factual documentary sort of explanations for the events uh, in this sort of mythological history. And we get stuck on that because that's our mindset. That's how we think because we've learned science. We've learned that earthquakes are the results of faults letting go, not God's punishing us. And so that I think is a critical part of how we look at storytelling, legends and such. Rather than try and conflate them with reality, we should recognize that for the people being told these stories back in the day, I don't think they had a sense that it was all literally what happened. It wasn't a lie either. people weren't just saying these things thinking that they were utterly false. They understand, I think that there was a difference between the time of legends and now. They understood that, that the world, but they also had a sense of things that was much different from our own, a different sort of paradigm. So when they talk about the waters being withdrawn, they're not simply trying to explain a tidal wave. That's not what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about these things called tsunamis, which occur when you trigger an earthquake underneath the water and displace a lot of it all at once. Now they're thinking in terms of of a deity. They're thinking about a world in which deities controlled things, where spirits controlled things, where calling a curse on somebody might have some real effects. They're thinking of things from a perspective that says all that is that's part of their daily reality. The same way that, the understanding of electricity and the generation of electricity is at least tangentially something we believe in, or that we think of as, we think of this phenomena called electricity. And when the power goes out, all our devices and everything go dead because they've lost their energy. Imagine what a person from Moses's time would have thought of that, or at least of the time that Moses was reputed to have been alive. You know, I believe there are a great number of things that were created within the story in the course of it being told and retold over time, in the course of it being shared and interpreted between people. It wasn't simply an act of dishonesty. It was people doing their best to tell stories about the world they knew in a way that they could understand. So you can see what I'm talking about here. There was a sense that the people were trying to do their best with limited information, with limited education, and they were trying to talk about their relationship with a God amidst all that. So I don't think of it as, and these are people who are trying to talk about their their lives. They're trying to talk about conquest and, you know from both sides, getting conquered and doing the conquering yourself. They were trying to, you know, describe the triumphs of the past. But we were thinking of it in terms of lies and truths. But that far back in antiquity, it's like how much information still remains hasn't been cleared away. So, but you cannot turn around and take that and say that this is how we're going to look at reality now because we know better, because we have better information. But there's another element to it, I think. There is another side to it, that if we try and mythologize the present too much, if we try and soak it all in a kind of fiction, dissolve it all in a kind of fiction, what we're only going to end up doing I mean, it's one thing to have a sort of a fuzzy sense of a distant past, but having a fuzzy sense of the present world, of the near future, that can be fatal. Political parties want to control what people think. Con artists want to control what people think. Grifters and hucksters and snake oil salespeople of all different kinds. They want to distort people's sense of reality. And why do they want to do it? Because, quite frankly, if they don't get what they want. They'll put us at an objective disadvantage in order to gain their own objective advantage. And that's the thing. We're dealing at the moment with a shooting in Houston. This is ICE pulled over some people, and one of them got shot. And so it's sort of like it's sort of like ICE starts out telling a story that basically they tried to ram them, that they tried to run over their people. And this is their story that they tell so they can justify that they shot somebody dead. Somebody who, by the way, it turns out wasn't some big bad criminal, was in fact a laborer who was working on correcting his status. And he's been around for 35 years, basically just, being a hardworking individual. So what does ICE do when they shoot this guy? When they shoot the wrong guy, the guy who wasn't, they were looking for a particular van and they mistook this van for that van. And it's like they're trying to mythologize everything. They're trying to convince their people, which is unfortunately far too easy. They're trying to convince their people that they acted in self defense. But the video shows more and more that ICE acted first and ICE didn't really identify themselves properly. So you get this sort of attempt to gaslight everybody else about what happened. But the bad thing about that for them is that they've actually kind of destroyed their credibility to the point where people like me, having heard their excuses before and then seen video that contradicts it, people like me immediately react by thinking, you know what? I think they actually acted first and they actually killed this person. And turns out we were right. And why did we think that? Because this is something that this officer induced danger, this using every excuse they can to play gunslinger up against these often unarmed people. It's, I'm thinking that some people enjoy killing or enjoy the power of dealing out this justice against illegal aliens. And, they know that's not socially acceptable. So they make up a story to try and sink everybody else in a kind of, haze of unknowing. I think it's necessary to forgive. I think it's necessary to forgive. Yeah, I've kind of lost my train of thought. I'm getting a little tired, but generally speaking, people who try to lie to you and really lie, not just, a little fib here and there, but who try and distort your reality, they're doing that because they're trying to gain off of you. And I think that's the thing you have to keep in mind is that there is incentive to tell lies. There's incentive to treat it all like a game and then to get people themselves who to get your followers treating everything like a game and to treat everything like it's a partisan issue. The one thing as a person on the autism spectrum that I despise is people who try and make the truth irrelevant. People say we're in a post-truth world. And what I would say to them is that there is no such thing and never will be. And things like COVID-19 demonstrate why that's a bad idea. Because COVID doesn't care whether you successfully convinced somebody that COVID was no big deal. COVID is going to be every bit as big a deal as COVID wants to be, you know, as biology allows it to. And, when we try to make reality go one way and nature decide against that, yeah. So I think the proper thing to say here is that some people want to fictionalize reality and then turn around and make the world of stories real, or say that it's got to be treated as real, that all the lore and canon has to be accepted as the solid truth of the world. But it doesn't work that way. Sooner or later, the toll must be paid. So I'm going to quit now, but you know, I'm just going to quit now. You all have a good night.